In 2018, monsters swarmed Seoul, and heroic players saved the city. Fast forward a decade, Hyukjin Kim, stuck in a 7-year rut after failing to become a player himself, gets a do-over. Reincarnating back to 2018, Hyukjin seizes his chance to rewrite history. With knowledge from the future and his reawakened player talents, Hyukjin battles beasts and conquers dungeons in a pulse-pounding quest for redemption and survival. The story begins on a bus where the protagonist was traveling when suddenly the sirens start blaring. He remembers that it was a scorching summer day, and the entire country felt like a sauna. As he looks around, something strange catches his eye. At first, it seems like an illusion, but it feels so real. A monstrous figure stands before him. Soon, more of these terrifying creatures appear, each intent on killing them all. The protagonist feels as though he was witnessing hell itself. Trembling, he fumbles for his phone to call the police, but before he can, people are being slaughtered right before his eyes. Panic sets in as he realizes what's happening. In the span of a minute, everyone on the bus was killed, like cattle in a slaughterhouse. There was no discrimination. Everyone was a target. It's not just the people on the bus. 80% of Seoul's population was doomed. He wonders if he will survive this nightmare. Tragically, as if by some cruel twist of fate, he discovers that he doesn't possess any special abilities or talents. The year was 2028, and in Jongno-gu, Seoul, things appear to be normal. 2 boys sit together, and the first one asks the second about his recent exam. The second boy sighs and admits that he bombed it. It was just too difficult. He worries about what will happen if he fails again. It would be his 3rd time. The first boy, trying to offer some advice, suggests that maybe he should give up on studying and consider a trade instead. The protagonist, Kim Hyukjin, was a 30-year-old man who has been studying for the civil servant exam for 7 years. He was an ordinary person with no special talents as a player. He remembers that 10 years ago, after the gates opened in Seoul, the city faced an unimaginable disaster. However, at the same time, a portion of the survivors awakened with abilities known as players. Kim, too, had once dreamed of becoming a player, but he gave up on that dream when he realized he lacked the talent for it. Now, his only goal was to pass the civil servant exam. He overhears a conversation about a video of Gwak Tae-yoon from the last day of the disaster. The people talk about how Gwak was incredible, wondering how he managed to fight so well. One of the boys mentions that this was why Gwak was called God Taeyoon. The other boy expresses that he would have achieved so much if he had such talent. The first boy responds that, typically, people like them have to work hard to become civil servants if they want to make money. The 2 of them continue discussing Gwak's talent, though they don't know exactly what it is. The second boy mentions that, long before, Gwak had scored the maximum 67 on the player aptitude test, the highest score possible, which measured the abilities of potential players. The second boy was shocked by this revelation and asked if it was true. The first boy confirmed, adding that this was why Gwak was called the dead genius. The second boy wondered why someone with such extraordinary talent would be repeating a test. The first boy speculated that Gwak's talent was discovered too late, which was unfortunate. He also mentioned that the second boy had previously mentioned Gwak possessing all 67 talent plates. The second boy explained that, after further testing, it was revealed that Gwak's talents were all sealed, which was truly mind-blowing. He also had the opportunity to turn his life around because of this discovery. The second boy agreed, noting that usually a person's talents are sealed once they turn 20, but Gwak was already 30. The implication was clear. He had no future as a player. Kim, overhearing their conversation, thought to himself that he already knew he had no hope of becoming a player. He then reflected on what had happened 7 years ago, when he had given his last shot at the player aptitude test, which was also a governmental test that examined the presence of talent. This test not only measured how many talents a person had, but also indicated whether they were active or inactive. Kim's results were disheartening. He only had 1 active talent plate, and the outcome was far worse than simply being told he had no talent. At that time, he hadn't understood the significance of it. What confused him even more was that the head of HR from the Players Association had personally delivered his results. The man had wished him good luck with his civil servant exam studies, though Kim couldn't fathom why someone in such a high position would take the time to do so. Kim remembered that the HR representative had come personally because, at the time, He had only graduated high school and had nothing to his name. He wasn't particularly good at anything, and his dream of becoming a hunter civil servant had been nothing but a series of failures. The life of a talented player and an ordinary person were worlds apart, like the difference between heaven and hell. That's why his hopeless delusion of becoming a player had always seemed like a luxury he could never afford. Kim decided to go back home and study more, but he had little hope. As he sat in his room, the TV was on, showing a man confessing his love to a woman. She asked him how much he had drunk that day. The kitchen around Kim was filthy, and as he sat studying, his thoughts drifted back to the cataclysm that had occurred on April 27, 2018. Kim recalled a video he had once watched, where a man described the horrifying incidents that marked the beginning of the cataclysm. The tutorial had started with the primordial fog in Seoul, and as a result, 145,000 out of 150,000 participants had died. It was fair to say that Jongno-gu, Seoul, had essentially been annihilated. The man in the video was visibly terrified of the primordial fog and mentioned how he could hardly move his feet in fear. Kim thought about Ma Sang-hyun, who had done so much during the cataclysm 10 years ago. Now, Ma was a renowned player. The person in the video continued, stating that whether in the past or present, he could say with absolute certainty that effort was more important than talent. He urged viewers to keep their eyes on him, promising that he would grow stronger and stronger. Kim wondered if effort was truly enough. No, he thought. He couldn't waste time thinking about such pointless things. There was no reason to get so hung up on things that were impossible. If he had talent, he would have had a chance as a player. He would have been chosen by a guardian and could have flaunted his wealth. He often had these thoughts, that everything was his fault. Kim sat down and wrote a letter, reflecting on how his mother had passed away from illness and how his sister had started working in a semiconductor factory, hoping they could escape poverty. But then she developed leukemia. Despite knowing he had to succeed for his family, Kim realized he had no talent, no money, and no backing. He had already failed the civil servant exam 3 times, and he wondered what he was missing and where everything had gone wrong. Lying in bed, he thought about how he had given his best effort, but it still hadn't been enough. He promised to work harder for his family, but he wondered if the next day's events would change if he truly gave his all. He felt like things would never change, that his life would remain the same forever. What should he do now? He felt so incredibly lonely. Finally, he fell asleep. The next morning, he woke up, glancing at the time. It was already too late. He realized it was the day of the interim evaluation, and despite going to bed early, he had still overslept. Kim decided to take a shower and head to cram school, wondering what time the interim evaluation was scheduled for. When he arrived at the bus stop, he noticed the bus was running late. He was planning to eat while heading to school. As he waited, he heard the announcement that buses 30A and 9370 would be arriving soon. Kim checked the board and saw that bus 702 would arrive in 2 minutes. For some reason, he felt something strange that day. When the announcement for bus 702 was made, it felt different from usual, though he couldn't explain why. It might have just been his imagination. Kim shrugged it off, deciding that everything was fine. He figured he should just review his notes before he got to his destination. As he got on the bus, he heard the weather forecast, which predicted clear skies in the afternoon. Walking down the aisle, he overheard a man telling his wife he would be home soon and asked her to keep the door unlocked. Other passengers were busy with their own things. He heard someone mention the new song by Pink Velvet. Kim sat down, thinking that Pink Velvet was a bit outdated now, and he couldn't believe they were making a comeback. He guessed it was hard for him to keep up since he didn't watch TV. As his mind wandered, he thought about where he had left off the previous day. His thoughts drifted to 10 years ago in Jongno-gu, when the cataclysm had begun. As Kim walked through the bus, people were wondering why it was so cold inside. Someone commented that it was still too early to be wearing short sleeves. Another person mentioned they felt uneasy, watching the news about the previous day's events. Kim thought to himself about the primordial fog and how the tutorial had begun. People outside the bus started to talk about the fog, saying it was so dense that they couldn't see anything. There was no coverage about it on the news. Suddenly, a strange, unpleasant smell filled the air, like sewage. Then Kim heard someone mention they were scared of something. Just then, an emergency disaster message flashed on his phone. It was from Seoul, announcing that the ethics fog had appeared on April 27, 2028. The message urgently requested that people drive safely during the confusing and hazardous time. Kim was shocked as he saw the date and wondered if he was reliving the events of 10 years ago. Was what was happening now the same as the cataclysm of that time? If it was, it meant the entirety of Yongnogu, including Gwanghwamun, was about to be affected. He couldn't believe it. Why did it smell so bad, and why couldn't he see anything in front of him? He feared that they might soon be engulfed by the thick fog, and the stench was horrific. Kim realized that if this was really the cataclysm from 10 years ago, and if he was indeed headed to Yongnogu, 145,000 out of 150,000 people would die. He thought the odds of him surviving were only 3%. Suddenly, people began to notice that it was getting darker. It felt like the world was being swallowed by the fog, and they asked the driver if he would continue driving. Kim realized that he had somehow returned to the past. Not only that, but he also knew what was about to happen. Suddenly, a screen appeared in front of him, referring to him as a player and instructing him to stand by. Then, the tutorial began. 10 years ago, the first tutorial began in Jongno, Seoul. Monsters flooded from dungeons that opened without any warning, and countless people were brutally slaughtered without a chance to resist. During the week of the cataclysm, a period later known as the open beta or the tutorial, over 150,000 people died in Jongno alone, and the survival chances were only 3%. It would go down in history as the worst day for humanity. However, after the chaos, the existence of the players emerged. These players quickly began subjugating the monsters, and the catastrophic dungeons in Jongno were slowly cleared. Raids on different dungeons were recorded, showcasing player combat footage. This footage was later used to create virtual dungeons. As a result, the world gradually began to recover from the disaster. Kim memorized all the recorded raids and completed the virtual dungeons over 100 times. He knew the incident better than anyone else. Even though he knew he couldn't become a player himself, he committed all those seemingly useless tactics to memory. In those moments, while playing through every virtual dungeon, he felt like the best player in the world. Suddenly, a message appeared. The tutorial would begin soon. Players were instructed to be ready and take their positions. Kim thought about the notification that had appeared with the cataclysm. He had only known about them in theory, but now they were real. He wondered if he had truly returned to the past. Suddenly, the bus jolted, and Kim wondered what had caused it. A boy next to him mentioned that he couldn't see anything, while another wondered if something had happened outside, making him late for school. Kim told himself to stay calm. This had happened to him before. It seemed that the others hadn't heard the tutorial notification, which meant he was the only player there. If he was to survive, he would have to use everything at his disposal. To prepare, he decided to analyze the situation carefully. He was instructed to pay close attention to his excels, and the name list of observers began to take an interest in him. Kim wondered about the nameless observer and whether it could be a guardian. The screen displayed a message saying that the nameless observer wished to grant him the open beta bonus. Kim was curious about the open beta bonus and who this guardian might be. Wasn't that bonus typically given to famous rankers? He recalled that guardians were beings who looked down upon players, and a player's fate was often decided by the bonuses and favors granted by the guardians. These guardians existed in a dimension above the players, which was why they used nicknames when contacting them. The screen displayed that through the open beta bonus, Kim had been granted the Calm Observer's Eye. Kim found it odd. Perhaps it was due to the bonus. But he suddenly felt much calmer. It was as if he were watching everything from a third-person perspective, completely impartial to the situation. The screen then flashed a message. The tutorial quest would begin in 10 seconds. The driver apologized to the passengers, explaining that the fog was so thick he couldn't continue driving. He said they would need to find another way to reach their destination. Kim thought to himself that the event was unfolding faster than he expected. People around him complained about the bad morning, and some realized they would be late, prompting them to get off the bus to run. With only 5 seconds left, Kim urgently told the other passengers not to get off the bus, insisting that staying on was the only way for them to survive. The screen informed Kim that the nameless observer had begun to take an interest in him. A girl pointed ahead, and everyone saw a portal opening in front of them. The screen then notified Kim that the intermediate administrator had appeared. An angry figure greeted them. She introduced herself as Senya, the intermediate administrator, and confirmed that they were now in the tutorial. The screen informed Kim that the quest was to survive in the tutorial field for 7 days, and that he couldn't leave the field during this time. The next phase of difficulty would be determined based on the number of survivors. Kim thought to himself that he might be second-guessing everything, but in reality, this was the same event from back in time, the moment of the cataclysm. The people around him were confused, wondering if Senya was talking about something real or if they were filming a movie. One person, annoyed, asked them to hurry up, clearly not in the mood for a prank. Senya told everyone to gather their strength if they wanted to survive the tutorial quest. A boy asked her what she meant by that. Just then, someone collapsed by the front window, sending shockwaves through the group. They wondered if they should call the police, thinking someone had died. Kim remembered that the strategy of those who had caused the original disaster had been to instill fear by using human cards, tossing bodies around to create terror. The screen flashed a message that screams and movement detected. Goblin troops becoming excited. The first goblin attack has started. The goblin troops had begun their invasion of the Jongno district. As a goblin slammed into the window of the bus, a boy, shocked, cried out that there was something on the window. They saw goblins climbing to the top of the bus. Another person urged them to get out of there, shouting that they needed to open the door. But Kim quickly warned them not to open the door. He knew the goblins outside were part of the massacre that had occurred before, so they needed to bunker down. He urged everyone not to think about things like the survival rate. It wasn't important right now. Their immediate focus had to be survival. After 10 years of raids, humanity had figured out the best way to survive a goblin attack. Facing the goblins head-on was a death sentence. Even though they had learned much over the years, there was no way for Kim to fight against them in the tutorial. Goblins were physically many times stronger than humans, and it wouldn't take long for them to break through the bus with their relentless attacks. The goblins used the hammer to break the bus windows, creating chaos as they entered. The people inside were alarmed and considered running away. However, Kim told them to remain calm, get down, and stay still. They were all too shaken to listen, but Kim urged them to follow his instructions if they wanted to survive, emphasizing that there was no time to waste. One man asked that what they were talking about, and they were supposed to stay still with everything happening outside. Another man suggested to let's think of a way to escape, but Kim believed it was too late, and that they weren't even considering staying put. The nameless observer watched Kim's actions with keen interest. His status window activated, and his inventory appeared on the screen. Kim was puzzled when he heard about the status window. As he looked at it, his current condition was displayed, and he was surprised to see how high his stats were. He had heard that even the first king had an average stat of 9 during the tutorial. Suddenly, a scream pierced the air. A goblin had broken through the window. The goblins rushed inside to kill them, and a boy, desperate for help, screamed, begging someone to save him. But before anyone could react, a goblin stabbed the boy with a sword, killing him instantly. Another goblin was about to strike a man with a hammer, and everyone feared for their lives. In that moment, Kim pretended to be dead, lying motionless on the ground. A goblin approached and used its weapon to check if Kim was still alive. Kim tried his best to remain motionless, hoping to avoid giving away his presence. The screen displayed that the beta bonus had been activated, Calm Eye of the Observer, which was currently in effect. Kim silently thanked the bonus for working. He remembered that certain safe zones existed within the tutorial field, and one of them was inside the bus. To meet the condition, he needed to remain completely still. He was anxious because any movement could cause the condition to fail, but somehow, he managed to stay calm, likely due to the bonus granted by the Guardian. Kim didn't understand why he had received this bonus, but it had allowed him to survive a little longer. Based on his knowledge of the future, derived from the Revaskull Act, he knew that the first goblin attack would last for about 10 minutes. It had taken those around 5 minutes to break into the bus, so if he could hold on for a little while longer, he might survive. Suddenly, a goblin approached him, reaching out as if to inspect him. The goblin even licked his face, but Kim remained perfectly still, knowing that any movement could cost him his life. He had to survive. The screen then notified him that the courageous Lion King wished to offer him a chance. Kim wondered if this was a different guardian. As he pondered this, another message appeared. showing that the courageous Lion King had sent him a high-strength elixir, expecting to see his courage tested. The elixir was a gift from the courageous Lion King, activating the beta bonus for 10 minutes. It temporarily increased Kim's strength by 6. Kim marveled at the 2 open beta bonuses, realizing that this elixir granted a significant boost, an increase of +6 to his strength. He quickly understood that when a player levels up, they receive bonus stats. Taking the elixir was like increasing his strength by 3 levels. Given this, Kim considered that if he decided to fight the goblins now, he would have enough strength to win. He also realized that the Guardian seemed to be encouraging him to fight. He wondered whether the Guardian truly believed he would accept such a challenge. However, he reminded himself that there were only a few seconds left before the event would end. If he stayed calm and avoided making any reckless moves, he could survive. Just then, the screen displayed a message. The courageous Lion King requests a trade with the intermediate administrator. Suddenly, Kim found himself face to face with Xenia. She explained that, as suggested by the courageous Lion King, she would be altering the tutorial field. Kim wondered if the Lion King had somehow made a trade with her. He knew that among all the guardians, the courageous Lion King was well known. He was a guardian with a particular fascination for reckless courage, the spirit of challenge, and the pointless passion of players. Unfortunately, he was also known to be a rather sinister pervert who took pleasure in watching players suffer and struggle against adversity, all while engaging in reckless bravado. Kim thought to himself that, given the courageous Lion King's disposition, what he surely wanted to see was the removal of the conditional safe zone. Xenia then informed him that the trade with the courageous Lion King had been concluded, and as per his request, the conditional safe zone would be abolished in 30 seconds. Kim responded by stating that if a guardian forcefully altered the scenario, there should be a corresponding reward for the affected player. He asked her if she was telling him to settle for just one high-strength elixir. She couldn't simply disregard the rules, especially if his life was on the line. Ignoring the commandments wasn't an option. The screen then displayed the nameless observer's surprise, and the courageous Lion King's presence remained. Xenia asked if he had mentioned the commandments. Kim agreed, telling her that it was not an unreasonable complaint to make given the severity of the situation. He noticed that she seemed genuinely surprised, as the laws and commandments hadn't been discovered until 7 years after the tutorial began. She then asked how he knew about the commandments. Kim replied, asking if it was important and stating that there was no need for a player to explain their methods. He also pointed out that they had already spent 10 seconds talking, which meant 10 seconds of his safe zone time had already passed. Xenia needed to compensate him for that as well. Xenia, completely surprised, asked if he was wrong. Xenia called Kim's name, acknowledging that he was correct and in accordance with the commandments. As a result, she increased the safe zone duration by 10 seconds, extending it until their conversation ended. She also promised to compensate him for the alteration of the scenario. The screen then displayed 2 items as compensation. The first was a quality lubricant, which could be used to sharpen a blade, or for various other applications. The second was a rusted iron sword, which Kim didn't expect to be very lethal, with an attack power ranging from 2 to 5. Kim wondered if this was the full compensation for the scenario change. Despite the modest reward, he decided to take whatever he could, especially since he had mentioned the commandments to secure the extra 10 seconds. The screen then announced that the first wave of goblins had ended, and all the goblins were now gone. This was a relief for Kim. He thought to himself that the conversation had worked in his favor, allowing him to survive without engaging in any combat, all while adhering to the safe zone conditions. However, the screen indicated that the courageous Lion King was disappointed. Suddenly, Kim felt a shift in his focus. He reminded himself that survival was his priority, especially considering the tutorial's grueling week-long duration. To survive for a week, he would need water and food above all else. With that in mind, Kim decided to leave the bus. He recalled that a convenience store was about 300 meters away, and it became his top priority. Having studied the area for 3 years, he had memorized the layout of the place, which gave him a distinct advantage as he set out toward it. Kim knew he had to move quickly. If he didn't hurry, he would be left defenseless again. The area around him was in ruins, and he saw a man lifting a woman, pleading for help as someone nearby was injured. Kim continued running, realizing that there were likely other survivors, but the thick fog made it impossible for him to locate them. He stopped near a car, frustrated that using the bus as a reference to orient himself had been difficult, so he needed to avoid any detours. He couldn't help but wonder about the bonus skill he had received earlier and why he was able to stay so calm despite the gruesome sight of corpses around him. Just as he was lost in thought, he noticed a hand reaching out and a voice calling for help. Kim turned to see a girl trembling on the road, desperately asking for his assistance. But then, he spotted a goblin on the other side. It shouldn't have been there. He had thought all the goblins had disappeared after the first wave ended. Was this some kind of anomaly or a mistake? The goblin was about to attack the girl, who was still begging for help. The girl mentioned that she wanted to see her mother. Kim initially found it hard to focus, startled by the situation, but he soon realized that she had not been harmed at all when the goblin had attempted to cut her legs. He wondered if she, too, had received an open beta bonus. Rather than feeling pain, she seemed to be shouting in fear, and the goblin, absorbed in its attack, had not noticed her remarkable resilience. Kim considered whether this was what they referred to as talent. Suddenly, Senya appeared, stating that the target was a baby goblin. She added that even though it was a level 1 goblin, it would still be difficult to defeat. Kim thought about the intermediate administrator, Senya, and if what she said was true, the girl's survival was even more impressive. Despite her panic, the girl's talent as a tanker was immense. Kim realized that not even the 5th king, Yu Hyun, would have been able to defeat a goblin of that level at her age. If he left her to fend for herself, more goblins would eventually arrive, and she would be killed. Kim knew he had to act. He opened his inventory to assess his available items. He knew this field better than anyone else, though it was all based on his knowledge of the virtual dungeons, theoretical strategies, and his own experiences. He grabbed the sword and thought to himself, recalling Senya's words about how a level 1 player would struggle to defeat a baby goblin in a direct confrontation. That warning, however, became irrelevant when the goblin wasn't even fighting back. Kim understood that all he needed to do was strike at the goblin's central weak point and aim for a clean, decisive stab. Kim struck the goblin, killing it with a single blow, and earned the experience points. He felt a sense of accomplishment as the goblin fell. Turning to the girl, he told her to get up and follow him. If she didn't keep up, he would have to drag her along. The girl stood up, trembling, and said she would follow him. They made their way to the convenience store. Kim warned her not to open the door under any circumstances. When she didn't respond, he asked her again if she understood. She nodded, her body still shaking with fear, and promised to follow his instructions. Kim observed that she was clearly overwhelmed by fear. Given the terrifying environment of the tutorial field, it would have been odd if she weren't scared. He reassured her that no matter what happened, she must not open the door, regardless of who or what might be seen outside. He understood her fear, but he knew that the situation required caution. Just then, the screen flashed an alert, indicating that the second wave of the goblin attack was imminent, and that the establishment of safe zones had begun. Kim noticed that the girl was also watching the screen. He asked if she could see it, and she confirmed. He then asked what the message said. She replied that the attacks would begin soon, and that the safe zones were being established. Kim inquired where the safe zones were being set up. The girl mentioned that schools, convenience stores, and hospitals were among the designated safe zones. Kim nodded, thinking to himself that her insights proved she was indeed a player with overwhelming talent. Typically, players could only confirm that convenience stores were safe zones during the second wave. However, players with talent were able to see that hospitals were safe zones as well. Kim also realized that he could see the hospitals as safe zones. He was confused, though, because additional safe zones seemed to have been created as well. The second wave of the goblin attack had begun, and Kim knew their top priority was to ensure their own safety. He warned the girl once again not to open the door under any circumstances. If she wasn't confident, she should even sit and face away from the door. The safe zones were now established, and the primordial fog began to lift. Outside, a few people had already been killed by the goblins, while others were fighting back, but ultimately, they too were slaughtered. When some of them saw the convenience store, they recognized it as a safe zone and rushed to the door, pleading for it to be opened. They shouted that everyone outside was going to die. Kim stood silently, refusing to open the door. The people continued to beg, but he remained motionless, his thoughts distant. He didn't feel anything at first, but now the agonizing weight of the situation hit him. They cried out for him to open the door to save them, asking why it wasn't budging. The goblins had arrived and started attacking, but the people still pleaded for the door to open. Kim knew that it was impossible to force them into the safety zone. Unfortunately, he understood that the moment the door was opened from the inside, the safe zone would vanish. If they had opened the door, they would have died as well. The only thing they could do was watch as the others perished. Kim vowed to engrave this moment into his memory, the god-forsaken system that set all of this into motion, and the guardians who watched it all unfold as if it were just a game. He swore he would return the favor someday. 6 hours later, the second wave ended, and the girl, Kang Sunhwa, was sitting beside Kim. She thanked him, apologizing for not greeting him properly before, and introduced herself. She was a 14-year-old girl, and she expressed how glad she was to have met him that morning. Kim responded that it was enough. He hadn't helped her expecting anything in return, and honestly, he didn't even know if she would survive until the end. If the situation called for it, he might have to use her as bait. Kang Sunhwa looked at him, pleading not to be thrown away. She asked if she had done something wrong. Kim realized that he had spoken too coldly. He quickly told her to calm down, and explained that he couldn't guarantee her safety until the end of the tutorial. It was difficult enough for him to stay alive. As long as his own life was not in danger, he wouldn't throw her away, but she needed to understand the gravity of the situation. He suggested she sleep now, as they would need to leave at first light the next day. Kang Sunhwa asked if he was serious and inquired where they would be going. Kim reminded her of the extra safe zone, the parking garage on the second floor of D Tower. He then told her they were heading to Gwanghwamun. As he observed her reaction, he realized that she couldn't see the extra safe zone settings. He had never heard about it before, but he knew something else. Gwanghwamun and D Tower were key points in the tutorial's attack phase. The next day, Kim filled a few bottles of water and packed his bag, preparing to leave the convenience store with Kang Sunhwa. As they stepped outside, they saw countless corpses scattered across the ground. Kim asked if she was all right. She nodded, but he could tell that she wasn't fine. The scene was too brutal for someone her age, and she was trying to act tough. But more importantly, he wondered what it felt like to walk through a destroyed city, surrounded by corpses, with no sign of any survivors. As they continued walking, Kim instructed her to look closely at the ground and tell him if she noticed something slithering around, like jelly. She pointed to something and asked if he was referring to what she was seeing. Kim recognized it immediately. It was a slime. He hadn't expected to find one so quickly. He knew slimes were neutral monsters, with their levels not properly displayed, making them some of the safest monsters to deal with. Ones even a young child could hunt. Kim quickly killed it and acquired experience points. He also received 3 coins, which surprised him. It was his first time receiving coins, and he was taken aback, though using the sword felt oddly familiar. Kang Sunhwa noted that the slime had disappeared. Kim explained that slimes were usually the weakest monsters and would keep appearing on their path. They would need to stop and kill them, which was why he asked her to stay alert and keep an eye on the ground. She assured him she would look out for them. As Kim pondered, he wondered why everything felt so easy. He had only ever used a sword in the virtual dungeons, but now it seemed so natural. He continued walking with the sword, feeling as though he had been using it for a long time. It felt strangely familiar, almost as if he had always known how to wield it.